People often ask me, how did Scotland end up being a part of the United Kingdom after fighting so long to remain independent? It may surprise you to learn that Scotland wasn't invaded or indeed taken by force. The main reason was we were skint. Bankrupt. Ordinary Scottish folk were not in favour of forming a political union with England, but the political classes and nobility were, because the English were willing to pay for it. And when you're bankrupt, well, material benefits take on a lot more importance. But other than a handful of people throwing stones at those delivering the gold from England to Scotland, Scotland's sovereignty was extinguished without a war, without a battle, or even a riot. So how did Scotland come to be in such dire financial straits? This is the story of the Darien scheme, Scotland's last colony. Following the death of Queen Elizabeth I of England in 1603, King James VI of Scotland became monarch of England and Ireland as well. This was known as the Union of the Crowns, but despite this union, Scotland and England were still autonomous states with their own parliaments. In the 17th century, the European powers were busy colonising the rest of the world, some more successfully than others, and Scotland was no exception. After several false starts, Scotland finally embarked on a colonial expedition that would alter the fate of the country forever, ultimately leading to the formation of the United Kingdom as we know it today. The architect of Scotland's last attempt at a colony was a controversial figure in the 1690s, William Paterson, a one-time director of the Bank of England, as much revered as he was despised. Depending on who you believe, he was either a shrewd businessman with strong convictions plagued by rotten luck, or a con man with foolhardy obsessions. Either way, he set in motion a series of events that would bankrupt Scotland. A staunch free market capitalist, Paterson was an enthusiastic advocate of global free trade, colonies and companies, apparently anticipating the global markets of today, although he did not foresee the disaster that would befall his colony or his country. He was, however, aware of how the burgeoning concept of financial hysteria could raise huge amounts of capital in a very short space of time. First and foremost, though, Paterson had what we Scots call patter, the gift of the gab. He was a gifted salesman, capable of selling shares by making the dull topics of capital and credit more interesting through his use of poetic language. When the Company of Scotland was formed in 1695, he managed to sell shares despite the country being in a financial lull. For reasons unknown, he was dedicated to the point of obsession with establishing a colony at Darien in Central America, in modern-day Panama. Perhaps he saw potential in the location as it bridged the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans and therefore significantly increased the capacity for trade. He said of the location,
"Trade will increase trade, and money will beget money, and the trading world shall need no more to want work for their hands, but will rather want hands for their work. Thus this door of the seas, and the key of the universe, with anything of a sort of reasonable management, will of course enable its proprietors to give laws to both oceans without being liable to the fatigues, expenses of dangers, or contracting the guilt and blood of Alexander and Caesar."
His hyperbole was effective, and the shareholders raised £400,000 in 6 months. The colony was to be known as Caledonia, after the Roman name given to Scotland. It should be noted that the Spanish established a colony at Darien in 1510, and abandoned it 14 years later after Panama City was established in 1519. Spanish imperialism, however, was fueled by gold and silver from the area, not trade, as William Paterson hoped to achieve. But why Paterson believed he could found and maintain a colony unmolested in the centre of the Spanish Empire remains to be seen. However, in the late 17th century, many European nations, including England, were battling for supremacy in the Caribbean, so perhaps Darien wasn't as incredible an idea as it first seemed. In 1695, the Company of Scotland was created by Act of Parliament after 48 Edinburgh merchants subscribed 1 guinea each to secure a patent from King William and Queen Mary for overseas trade. The Act included very generous trading privileges, including a monopoly on trade to Asia, Africa, and America for 31 years, while only being required to pay a nominal hogshead of tobacco to the king as blench duty. The company was also exempt from customs, taxes, cesses, supplies, and other duties for 21 years. These advantages were not looked upon favourably by rival companies elsewhere in Europe, and while investment to the Company of Scotland increased, so too did the opposition to the company's very existence. The Company of Scotland, therefore, wished to keep their cards close to their chests, but with offices and subscribers in both Edinburgh and London, this proved to be difficult. The English were now aware of the company and requested a copy of the Act of Parliament to be sent from Scotland. The company began raising capital in London, and William Paterson was to receive 2% of the final amount raised, plus 3% of any profits made by the company over 21 years. Subscriptions were projected to raise £600,000, an obscene amount of money at the time, of which Paterson would receive the equivalent of about 2.4 million in today's money. Future controversy surrounding these conditions would pressure Paterson into relinquishing his right to the money. In 8 to 10 days after the subscription book opened in London, £300,000 was pledged, with another £300,000 expected to be pledged in Edinburgh. This concerned the English East India Company, but the Scots claimed they wished to work in harmony with the English, to bring the countries closer together.
Nature seems to have intended us for one people, as having concentered us within the same liquid walls. We are the subjects of one king. We speak the same language, differing only in dialect. As most countries do we possess the same religion, differing only in some forms, which may or may not be. Our laws point at the same end, to distribute justice and defend liberty and property.
This was to be highly prophetic, as the actions of the Company of Scotland would eventually lead Scotland and England being even more closely tied, becoming one people. However, the bit about religion is highly contestable. The English were justly concerned about losing their monopoly and set about creating legislation in an attempt to undermine the Company of Scotland, such as making it illegal for English people to invest in the company, banning shipbuilders and other tradesmen from working with them, and even setting up further English trading companies with similar privileges granted to the Scots by the King. The House of Lords petitioned the King to intervene, however he had more pressing concerns like the 9 Years' War on the continent, which was severely harming the English currency. This financial insecurity and hysteria around the Company of Scotland led to several directors of the company being questioned in both the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and told their subscriptions acquired in England were illegal, null and void. And so, William Paterson began raising capital in Scotland in earnest, beginning with the upper echelons of Scottish society, in the hopes that the rest of the social hierarchy would be encouraged to subscribe. Anne, Duchess of Hamilton, was the first subscriber, pledging the maximum amount of £3,000, followed by the Countess of Rothes, Earl of Haddington, Lady Margaret Hope of Hopetoun, the Provost of Edinburgh, and then a slew of lairds, merchants, doctors and lawyers. 69 subscriptions were taken over 4 hours. £50,400 was raised, and crowds gathered to see. Walter Herries described the scene rather impressionistically.
They came in shoals from all corners of the kingdom to Edinburgh, rich, poor, blind and lame, to lodge their subscriptions in the company's house, and to have a glimpse of the man Paterson.
The blind had a glimpse, did they? This was, of course, sheer hyperbole, but it does convey the unprecedented nature of the company's reception, hitherto unheard of in Scottish joint stock investment. Even reading that sentence bored me. 54% of the money was raised in Edinburgh, with a grand total of £400,000 being reached after the subscription book later opened in Glasgow. This meant that a huge amount of Scotland's liquid capital now rested within the Company of Scotland. You can see where this is going, can't you? With the subscription goal reached in Scotland, the company set their sights on raising even more funds, this time in Amsterdam. Like in England, the Dutch were concerned with losing their trading monopolies, and everything in their powers was done to thwart the Scots. The Scots then turned their sights to Hamburg, deciding to have their ships built on the River Elbe there. This was partly a publicity stunt. Seeing great vessels built in the city would hopefully impress potential investors. However, once again, the Scots were thwarted, this time by an English diplomat living in Hamburg. He had managed to convince the English Parliament to inform the Senate of Hamburg that if they in any way aided the Company of Scotland, then a diplomatic crisis would ensue. This display by Parliament was entirely sanctioned by King William, the monarch of both Scotland and England. Writing in The Price of Scotland, Douglas Watt says,
"This highlighted two key points. Firstly, the English government would do whatever it could to oppose and undermine the Scottish Joint Stock Company. Secondly, the constitutional relationship between the kingdoms was a hindrance to Scottish attempts to develop their economy. An effort to establish a colonial trade was being undermined by their own king. This act symbolised the stranglehold placed on Scotland politically and economically by the Union of 1603.
Although English interference was certainly a major component of the failure of the company to raise funds on the continent, it was not the only contributing factor. William Paterson had been entrusted with a large sum of money from the funds raised to send to London in an attempt to take advantage of the weak English sterling. Instead of depositing the money in the Bank of England, Paterson gave it to his merchant friend, James Smith. It soon became apparent that Smith's finances were in a calamitous state. He was in considerable debt and had just been handed the equivalent of £1.7 million in today's money. Needless to say, a scandal ensued, with rumours spreading of a ruse orchestrated by Paterson and Smith to disappear with the entirety of the company's capital. While Smith was clearly exceptionally shady, the rest of the directors were inexperienced with joint stocks and almost bankrupted the company within the first year through reckless spending. Not looking good, is it? 5 ships sailed from the port of Leith, north of Edinburgh, to Darien on the 14th of July 1698, stopping at the Portuguese island of Madeira for 3,000 gallons of wine along the way. We Scots do love our booze. On the 2nd of November, the colonists arrived at their destination and established New Caledonia. On the 25th of March 1699, it was reported back in Edinburgh that the Company of Scotland had established a colony at Darien. Of the 1,200 colonists, 76 had died on the voyage or shortly after reaching the isthmus, including William Paterson's wife. Despite this, and despite Paterson himself contracting a tropical disease, perhaps yellow fever or malaria, spirits in Scotland remained high. Indeed, the prospect of gold mines in the vicinity of Darien led pamphlet producers in Scotland to surmise that the colony could make more in 1 week than a sugar plantation made in an entire year. Some gold was mined and shipped back to Scotland to show shareholders that they were right to invest, even though mining was never the intended purpose of the colony. And so, the initial months of Caledonia were frantically optimistic, with shareholders being asked to stump up a further 5% of their subscriptions in cash, in addition to the 25% already paid for ships and supplies. Lord Basil Hamilton, one of the company directors, said in a letter to his brother,
"A fine country, a good harbour and whatnot, and very well received by the inhabitants. If this affair go on as it begins, I think it the greatest happiness and advancement that could befall this poor nation, and which may lift up our heads which were just sinking. It's not to be told you how joyfully it is received by all people. Our thistle yet, I hope, will grow green."
However, not everyone was so favourable. Walter Herries, the surgeon on an earlier expedition to Darien, had returned disillusioned, and set about viciously attacking the directors of the company in 1700 when he published the scathing but highly partisan A Defence of the Scots Abdicating Darien. After several failed attempts at establishing a colony, including in Nova Scotia, East New Jersey, and South Carolina, the Scots seemed finally to be proving their mettle with Darien. They believed a colony was necessary to improve Scotland's economy and provide new markets for their mercantile goods as per the Dutch and English East India Companies. King James VI and I had granted a charter to earlier Scottish companies to allow them to trade alongside existing English companies in the East Indies, Levant, Greenland and Russia, but this charter was soon withdrawn after complaints from the English. Other Scottish companies were attempted, but none were successful until the financial revolution of 1690, although one had a profitable sojourn into West Africa until the colonists were captured and massacred by the Portuguese. From 1690 to 1695, many successful joint stock companies were formed in Scotland, including the Bank of Scotland, which is still in existence today. The colonists' new home was as much a paradise as could have been hoped. But the geography and climate were not conducive to Northern Europeans. Provisions soon began to run dry. A ship sent home for supplies was wrecked half an hour after leaving, and a number of people on board drowned. In February, another ship was sent to trade with the Dutch, but was captured by the Spanish. By April 1699, the situation was becoming dire, with death and disease continuing to take their toll, the building of defences taking far longer than anticipated, and a lack of food leading to many people abandoning the colony. Then, on the 18th of May, Governor of Jamaica, Sir William Beeston, proclaimed, under instruction from the English government, that the Scots had broken the peace between King William and the Spanish, and that any subject of the king would face severe penalties if they corresponded with or provided provisions to the Darien colony. Morale all but collapsed, and the colony was abandoned. Of the 1,200 who sailed from Leith, at least 705 died at Darien, or on the journey to New York upon the colony's abandonment. Walter Herries described the experience.
Caledonia, where there's nothing to be had but hard labour, sweat, hungry bellies, and shallow graves.
Hope was abandoned, the colony abandoned, and the people felt abandoned by their king. Political tensions ran high as the stories of what happened in Central America began to come to the fore and circulate. Protestant King William was increasingly unpopular due to his actions against Scotland, to the point where people began shifting their allegiances to the previous monarch, King James VII and II, who had been deposed in the Glorious Revolution 10 years earlier. I could make an entire video on the religious aspect of this tale, but for now, just know that the Glorious Revolution was one of many conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, and these tensions are still felt today. By 1701, the Scottish Parliament was still disorderly and contentious, with petitions to appropriate blame on the English for their part in the downfall of the Darien colony. The affair was used as propaganda by King James VII's supporters, the Jacobites, to undermine the authority of King William, but eventually order was restored and maintained, even after King Louis XIV of France declared his support for James's son and his Jacobite followers. William died childless in 1702, and James's daughter, Anne, a Protestant, ascended to the Scottish and English thrones. Anne was also childless, and the English vehemently opposed a Catholic restoration, so Parliament passed the Act of Settlement, prohibiting Catholics from inheriting the throne, infuriating the Scots. The Act of Settlement would only be fully effective, then, if Scotland and England were united under one Parliament, being one kingdom. Over the following few years, the Scottish and English were engaged in discussion over uniting the two kingdoms. In 1706, the English offered a very large lump sum of money, known as the equivalent, to be paid to certain Scots if union was achieved. The majority of those certain Scots were shareholders in the Company of Scotland. Amazingly, the equivalent did not only cover the amount of money that had been raised by the shareholders, but also included interest of 5% per annum since the money had been lost. It should be stated that William Paterson received no share of the equivalent. Between unrest in Scotland over the Act of Settlement and further wars with France, England needed Scotland on their side. Union must be achieved. The Scottish aristocracy were bribed. The English promised free trade between the two countries. They promised Scotland would keep her own legal system, the rights of the ancient boroughs, and a separate act to safeguard the Presbyterian structure of the Church of Scotland. Riots ensued in Edinburgh and Glasgow in October 1706 as political support for Union grew in the Scottish Parliament. The Jacobite opposition's tactic was merely to stall and delay proceedings. The Jacobites were unorganised and, like all of their rebellions, failed. The treaty was ratified in the Scottish Parliament on the 16th of January 1707 by 110 votes to 69. Nice. Lockhart of Carnwath, a staunch Jacobite and anti-unionist, said,
"The truth of the matter lies here. A sum of money was necessary to be distributed amongst the Scots, and this distribution of it amongst the proprietors of the company was the cleanliest way of bribing a nation to undo themselves, and alas, it had the designed effect."
The main downfall of the Darien project, and therefore Scotland as a sovereign nation, was the huge amount of investors involved. Not just city merchants, but many nobles, lairds, lawyers, ministers, all bought into the scheme. The failure of Darien, then, not only had huge financial implications, but political implications as well. Union was achieved not because the Scots felt it would lead to long-term economic benefits, although arguably it did, but for short-term monetary benefits. A deal between two political elites, bought and sold for English gold, as Robert Burns put it. The United Kingdom came into being on the 1st of May 1707 and has divided opinion on these islands ever since, more so now than ever. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment and share it if you like, if you think other people might like it. I also have some merch and I have a Patreon down below if you like what you watched and would like to see some more or would like to just support the channel. So that's it for now. Darian Rastamaha.